Well, Dr. Michael Gorman, thank you so much for joining me on the channel today for a discussion on St. Thomas Aquinas and his metaphysics. I am delighted to have you on. I was doing a little bit of research on your background, and I think if I read out your academic achievements, we would run through the whole hour. You might be the first person I've interviewed that has 2 PhDs and a PhL, which I had to Google what a PhL was. But thanks so much for being here.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks so much.
I am so delighted to have you. I do want to ask, like, I've never met someone who's gone through, 3 times in that sense. Do you just love the academy? What made you kind of keep coming back for more?
Well, okay, so the true story is actually kind of embarrassing and shows what happens when you try to plan your life. My original goal was just to get a master's degree in philosophy, or as it turned out, a PhL, a licentiate in philosophy, and then to get a doctorate in theology. But I got delayed along the way, essentially because of my wife's studies. And so to have something to do, I enrolled in a PhD program in philosophy. And then I finally got around to and got the degree. And then I went on and did the doctorate in theology. And then I applied for jobs in both fields, and I ended up taking the best job that I got, which was this one. But like the point is, my original goal was to do theology, and I ended up doing philosophy. So that thing that I just sort of did along the way turned out to be crucial.
Well, I love that a PhD is the type of thing you can just kind of do along the way to
Well,
fill your
it
time.
sounds crazy, but it's kind of how it happened.
I love it. That's fantastic, and it is a good testament of kind of just how things don't always go according to plan, but it has certainly seemed to work out.
Yeah.
And I imagine having both the background in philosophy and theology has been helpful for you in your own work, and I think will kind of probably show in the conversation we're going to have today. But have you found that to be the case, kind of
Oh,
having both of those?
absolutely. I mean, I have kept a foot in theology. Some of my publishing and conference going and stuff is theological. And it never hurts to have more philosophy. Um, it just makes you so much better as a theologian. And then the flip side of it is, in philosophy, just being aware of the additional possibilities that there are in reality is always good. I mean, philosophy is a kind of wide-ranging thing. It's true, but the fact is that what exists by nature, as it were, is actually it's narrower than the full range of what's possible, and theology keeps us reminded of that. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'll say, my background was starting in theology for my undergrad and realizing at the end of it that I was so horribly just behind on philosophy. That was part of what animated me into doing what I'm doing now. And my master's was like, I need to read more broadly
Yep.
and to get some of this background because it was so crazy to me that I could go through a full theology degree and take, I think I had like one class on philosophy in
You're
my
not the only
undergrad.
person. You can go all the way and get a doctorate in theology and not know any philosophy.
Yeah, well, hopefully
It's
we can
terrible.
change a little bit of that
Yeah.
today. And so maybe let's talk about that. I think that won't be too unfamiliar for a lot of people who watch my channel. I primarily focus on theology and church history. And the people who watch this, whether they have an academic background in it or
Yep.
not, I think they come at it from probably starting with theology.
Yeah.
And then they hear about someone like St. Thomas Aquinas, and he is this huge figure, right? And if
Right.
you've ever tried to read Thomas, he's very clear, but it's dense. Like it's not an easy kind of light Saturday morning read for most people,
Yes.
and so people shy away from it. But when you have students maybe who have a theology background and they're taking a class with you on Thomas's metaphysics, what are some of the first things that are like the biggest hurdles to overcome as far as maybe their misconceptions or conceptual difficulties? What are some of those initial roadblocks for
Yeah,
people?
that's good. So some of it is technical stuff. Some of Aquinas's writings, I mean, he shares this with other people from his period. They have this certain structure, which at first is very off-putting. He starts with the views opposite to the ones that he's actually in favor of. So he gives a few objections. Then later he responds to them. So that's just an initial roadblock. You have to learn how to read this weird kind of text. Now, not all of his writings are like that. So if you find it really off-putting, you can read the Summa Contra Gentiles. He basically just writes in a normal sequential way that we're used to. Another thing I think that might be a roadblock, I know it was for me, you pick up this idea somewhere that Aquinas is always super clear and super precise, and there's no looseness about his presentation. I don't know where you get that idea from, but you do. And then if you read very, very carefully, you start noticing, oh, there's a little bit of a hitch in this argument, or wait a minute, 40 pages ago, he said something that does not here he's saying there's 3 kinds of whatever, but before he says there's 2 kinds of whatever. So what's going on? And I actually went through this period where I thought, what is it with this guy? He's been oversold. He's kind of sloppy. And then I realized, actually, no, I decided that I would think of him as a relaxed Italian. He's not as high strung as I wanted him to be. And you have to learn how to go with that. It's funny because it's all laid out in such a formal way. You think that, there's never any looseness, but sometimes there is. Often he's got a question in front of him. He's trying to answer that question. And he's not necessarily worried about how to make it obvious how what he said fits with what he said on something else 50 pages earlier. So you have to learn how to be a little relaxed and try to figure out what he's up to.
That makes sense to me. It makes me wonder, what do you think is the best direction from which to approach Aquinas? Because he's many things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he is a scholar of scripture, a theologian, a philosopher, all of these things. He's a man of the church, right? So
yeah.
Do you see him? We're going to be talking about his metaphysics here primarily today, but do you think, would he like that we're starting here? How do you think is the kind of the proper way of seeing Aquinas? Because as you talk about him being kind of relaxed, a relaxed Italian, and maybe not being as precise as we want him to be, is that because we're trying to cast him in the mold of a modern analytic philosopher? Or I guess, what is he? How should we start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I can't remember. I think there's a way in which, okay, so this is a sort of absurd analogy maybe, but I'm going to give it anyway. Thinking of in the Acts of the Apostles, when the Ethiopian eunuch, he's reading from scripture. And Philip says, hey, what are you reading? Right? He's an ancient person. He's reading out loud. So you know what people are reading. And he says, do you understand what you're reading? The guy says, how can I understand unless someone explains it to me? Okay. So that was Holy Scripture. But it's true for some things that are merely human texts too. And Aquinas, and in a way, Aristotle's even worse. It's kind of like that. I don't think all that many people could just pick up Aquinas and make a huge amount of progress without help from somebody who already knows some. So if you can do this together with other people, if you can, watch videos or read introductory texts or commentaries or something, I do think it helps. There's not, I just do think that helps. If you have to go it alone, I don't know what to say, persevere. You'll hit a lot of roadblocks early. Maybe you just keep going and things will start to fall into place. But it's hard because, in the Summa Theologiae, he says, oh, this is for beginners. Well, he means people who are beginning theology after having studied Aristotle for 6 years. So they're not really beginners. It's just a very difficult problem. But I think if you find that you need help of some sort or other, you should not think, oh, I'm a failure. It's more like he's an extremely difficult author, and it's not really a standalone project.
I love the context of what he means by beginner, because there is nothing more humbling than reading Aquinas say, this is for beginners, when you have no idea how to make heads or tails of it. So I do think that that's encouraging for people. You mentioned in there that it would be an expectation that you've studied Aristotle for 6 years before this, and you made a brief comparison to studying Aquinas being a bit like studying Aristotle. And I want to ask at this point, there's certainly a connection between these two figures,
Yeah.
a deep connection, but there's debates over, I guess, how far that connection goes
Yes.
and what that is. So how would you describe the connection between Aristotle and Aquinas? On the one hand, is Aquinas footnotes on Aristotle, or on the other hand, is Aquinas doing something almost entirely original that's just inspired by Aristotle, or is it somewhere in between?
Yeah. More complicated than any of that, I would say. Um, some people seem to think that Aquinas basically agrees with Aristotle on everything, except that Aquinas also has Christian revelation, so he has to change some of the things in Aristotle, and that he sees more clearly, perhaps, than Aristotle. But I think it's Aquinas is less Aristotelian than that. He disagrees with Aristotle on a number of things, important things, and there are also kind of I don't know, sort of deeper differences um, that can't be accommodated for, but just by calling them disagreements. So for Aristotle, the most basic reality is the universe, the cosmos. And it just so happens to be the case that the best and coolest thing in it is the gods, or, well, sometimes you seem to get the idea in Aristotle that there's like a top god, the first mover. Um, but God does not create the world for Aristotle, and it looks like for Aristotle, probably God doesn't even know that the world exists. He's just doing his God thing, which is contemplating the best thing that there is, which just so happens to be himself. It seems narcissistic, but like it's not his fault, right? Why should he think about anything less than the best? He is the best, so he just eternally thinks about himself. All right. So that's a very, very different view from Aquinas. You could say, well, this is something they disagree on. But I mean, it's a spectacular difference because for Aquinas, or for any other Christian thinker, um, there might not ever have been a world. That's just something that God freely chose to create and didn't have to, and didn't do it out of any necessity or any need or anything like that. It's out of sheer generosity. So that's a huge difference. But another thing that's different, or different is the wrong word. Another thing that adds complexity to this is Aquinas is familiar with a very wide range of intellectual tradition. He was kind of a voracious reader. He draws on Roman sources, he draws on the church fathers, and he knows a lot of this stuff. And when he has a chance to get more, he takes that chance. There was some weird kind of historical glitch where he was living in a certain part of Italy and the papal library moved to that part of Italy, and he was like, oh, and he got more his hands on more books, and you can see it changes some. He gets more hands on more of church councils and things like this. And of course, through his daily, religious observances and through his own just voracious and passionate intellectual and spiritual reading, he was very familiar with the scriptures. And so, and he knew about the Muslim philosophers too, and a bit of the Jewish philosophers. So he's got his hands on a lot of stuff. And Aristotle is a very important figure at the time, and you have to deal with Aristotle if you want to be a philosopher or a theologian in, the second half of the 13th century. But he's by no means only dealing with Aristotle. He's dealing with all of it. So in one way, it's a very creative synthesis, but in another way, Aquinas doesn't try to be original. He's not interested in being original. He's just interested in getting things that are right. And so, like, if you read, for example, okay, so like the theological field I know best is Christology. So if you know something about those early debates in the first few centuries, and you've read a bit of Cyril and Nestorius and all that stuff, and then you read Aquinas, it turns out a lot of these amazing things that Aquinas says, he's just getting them from the church fathers. It's fine. He's not trying to say something clever. Sometimes he does, but he's mostly just trying to say something really true and really clear, and to like bring things together so they all fit together and make sense.
I find that really helpful when we look back at like the history of ideas, the history of philosophy, theology, or just history in general,
Yeah.
we often have this concept of these great luminaries which kind
Yes.
of change everything, these like this great man
Yes.
theory of history, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, Aquinas, as we look at the history of thought, is one of those names that comes up,
Yes.
right? If you went for best philosopher, best theologian, he'd be on both of those lists most likely. And I'm curious, with this idea in mind that he's not particularly trying to be original, he's just
Yes.
trying to be right, and some of it he's taking from whatever he can get. Why do you think it is that he has been such an influential figure who
Yes.
we're still talking about? Like, there's not that. I mean,
Right.
this is a little niche, but
Right.
a lot of people will know the name, right? Outside of people who watch videos like this in their free time. So,
Yeah.
why has he had such a lasting impact, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, just to pick a crazy example of this, there was that silly comedy video by Monty Python where they have like the philosophers playing soccer. And I think like the referee is like Confucius and the two linesmen are Augustine and Aquinas. Right. So like he shows up in this context. I don't know if you've ever seen this video.
No, I'll
It's
have to watch it
it's
though.
like a 3-minute philosophers playing soccer video. It's
Okay.
silly, of course. It's just a joke. But anyway, the point is Aquinas made the list. They thought of him. I'm just supporting your point. The people have heard of him. Okay. Um, of course, part of it is like Aquinas is a super genius. There's no question, right? He's incredibly smart, like weirdly smart. Sometimes he just kind of freaks me out. I just think I don't understand. He seems to me to have very seldom gone down wrong paths. Like I could think of some of the things that he came up with. I think I could have come up with that one after like 5 years, but he's got a few of those on every page. So he didn't spend 5 years on each one. It was more like an hour or 10 minutes. He just seems to zero in on the truth very quickly. It's weird. And you see it from very early works, like the guy's in his early or mid 20s, and he's already saying some of his best things. I don't understand it. So that's part of the story. There's no question. However, there's also something about the time at which he lived. This is a sort of weird, you know, uh, counterfactual scenario. What if this person had existed even just 50 years earlier or 50 years later? I think it would have been even 30. I think it would have been considerably different and not as good. Why? So Aquinas lived and worked late enough that Aristotle had been fairly well processed um, in the Christian West. And so, if he was too early, he wouldn't have had Aristotle, or only a little bit of Aristotle. Or he would have been one of the very first people to read Aristotle. But he was like the sort of second wave. And so some of it was a bit pre-processed and he could handle it better and more efficiently. Now, if he, and because, Aristotle is an important part of his thought, that makes a big difference. Another thing is that if he had lived, let's say, the high point of his career had been 30 years later, um, the whole intellectual scene was becoming very different. So the way to put it is everything is getting more and more complicated and more technical. So you pick some topic where Aquinas will discuss it in like 200 words. Authors, only 20 years later, they'll take 20 pages to discuss the same topic. Now it's cool, it's interesting, but when you have to take 20 pages to discuss that means that you're not going to be able to cover as much ground. And one of the things, and that's sort of leading me to one of the things that I think is most important for Aquinas' influence is the kind of works that he left behind. The Summa Theologiae is an attempt he didn't quite finish, but to capture all of Christian theology in one big synthetic picture. He wrote a book called Summa Contra Gentiles, which is also an attempt, a completed attempt, to capture Christian theology. It has a different scope. More of it is, if you will, philosophical stuff, but even, a greater proportion of it. But even so, um, these works became things that you could then look at and say, here is a worldview, a very sophisticated Christian worldview. If every topic that you want to talk about takes 20 or 30 pages to get through, you can't compile works that are such worldviews. And so what you see, not all that long, is people will write longer and longer treatises on narrower and narrower topics. And it's rarer that you get these big compendia, as it were. So there's something about his having lived at the time that he did that made it possible for him to produce works of this sort.
That's helpful, and it's really interesting to see how him being situated, even just a generation or two in a
Yeah,
different
yeah.
direction, could have been different, which is always just fascinating to think about. And it does get. We won't go down this rabbit trail right now, but the idea of like possible worlds, like how it could have
Yeah.
been possible, which is something that comes up in your
No,
work,
it's
right?
fun to think about, and I don't know. I don't have firm views always.
Yeah. Well, perhaps we'll chase that down in a bit. But I want to start to kind of get into his metaphysics so that people can kind of begin to
Yeah.
grapple with some of the key concepts here. And I love, as someone who has a cat who is fond of it most of the time, how often cats came up and kind of your discussion in your book. And so I think it would be helpful to get at the categories that Aquinas is using by looking at like if Aquinas were to look at a cat. I think you
Yeah.
use, what is it, Rusty and Mickey? Were
Mickey,
those the
that's right.
names?
Those
Yeah.
are the
Okay.
cats.
What would he see? Like, what is a cat
Yeah.
for Aquinas?
So metaphysically, a cat is a substance. So it's an individual. It's independent. I'll explain in a second what that means and what it doesn't mean. But it's like freestanding. It exists on its own, and then it's unified. So to say that it's unified is to say, it's not like a pile. It's not like a stack of coins or a pile of trash, or even a bunch of Legos stuck together. It's much more tightly unified. So it's one thing, one agent. Um, and it's independent. It's freestanding. So if you think of, okay, so like this cup here, the color of the cup is not freestanding. It needs the cup. It resides in the cup. It piggybacks on the cup. But there's a sense in which, now I'm going to have to qualify this in a second, but there's a sense in which the cup um, is freestanding. It just exists on its own. It doesn't need to rely on other things. So a substance is this individual, unified, independent, freestanding thing. And for Aquinas, substances always have natures or essences, same thing. And those essences or natures give them powers. It makes it possible for them to do certain things and to be acted on, to act in certain ways and to be acted on in certain ways. And so if you take this general picture of substances which have natures and they have other features that are not, essential to them, but that are added extra features, accidental features. Um, and if you think of them as having powers to act and be acted on, then you can explain a lot of what's going on in the world. Now, the qualification that I kept alluding to has to do with that substances like cats or humans, they're independent, but they're not absolutely independent. And the most important thing here is that they depend at every moment, all the time, on God. Not just because God made the world in which they emerged, and not just because God made them and then said, there you go. But in fact, God is always holding them in creation and bringing them to actuality. And so there's a way in which are things that Aristotle doesn't say. And so, or not really, that's getting complicated. Anyway, but the point is, Aquinas has two things going on at once. He looks at the natural world as something that contains like these what I was calling freestanding substances and their features with their powers. And you can treat it on its own and see it as like a system that makes sense on its own. And yet, at the same time, without undercutting anything that was said, that whole system and each element of it is in another way just secondary to and received from God's creative power. So in one way, it's like it exists in its own little universe, and in another way, that's completely wrong because it's all a creature from God.
And I think this is going to get important when we get into kind of metaphysics outside normal operating
Yeah,
conditions toward the end, where we talk about transubstantiation and other things, just to kind of give keep people on the edge of their seat for a
yeah,
little bit.
yeah,
But before we get to the outside normal operating conditions, I think this is helpful. So we have kind of substance,
yeah,
we have accidents. Now, if someone, I talked about a cat, that a cat, um, has a substance. But what if we were to say something like this mouse on my desk?
yeah,
Would that be a substance?
yeah. Yeah, I used the example of the cup, and as soon as I did, it's like, So, because, okay, so a mouse, computer mouse, um, is not a natural substance. It's an artifact. This is one of the things that gets debated about. My, I think that the way to make most sense out of this, um, is that something like a computer mouse or a table, it's not really a substance. It's a bunch of substances, pieces of stuff, whatever, and they work together really well. Some of them are very stable. They seem kind of like substances. It's understandable, but they aren't really, because the unity that they have is imposed on them from without, and especially the unity that they have and the point of them is a product of human intention. So Aristotle says that a nature is an internal principle of motion and rest, right? So things act the way they do, and then they come to rest and stop at a certain fulfillment, um, because of the way they are, because of what's internal to them. But what makes a mouse, a computer mouse, a computer mouse, is that people decide to use it, and so it's only that it's based on something that comes from without. And
Okay, that's
in that sense, they don't really have natures in the strict sense, and they're not really substances.
this is helpful. Okay, so substances have natures, whereas something that's only acted upon
Yeah,
by humans might not have a nature and wouldn't be a substance there. I, so far, so good, right?
yeah.
Okay, so that
I feel
gets
like you're
potential.
setting me up.
No, no, no. Well, I
No,
don't.
no, that
I'm
would
not
be
trying
great.
to.
I would be thrilled when I saw it. Ah, here it is.
Well, I suppose that's what they do in philosophy, but I would not be so bold as to do that. But another set of kind of terminology, set of ideas that comes out in Aristotle that I want to kind of that people might be familiar with to bring into Aquinas here would be this idea of like actuality and potentiality.
Yes.
Because when we talk about kind of composing things of other things, my desk, I don't actually know what it's made of. I don't think it's real wood, but let's say it
Right.
was wood.
Yeah. Let's say it's wood.
Um, we could say that in that tree, right, wherever this
Yeah.
wood came from, there's the potential of desk.
Yeah.
How does kind of Aquinas take up these ideas of actuality and potentiality? Because it's huge in Aristotle's metaphysics. Where do we see that within Aquinas?
Yeah. So Aristotle on, not Aristotle, Aquinas on actuality and potentiality. Um, he uses this a lot, and he radicalizes the notion that he gets from Aristotle. So for Aristotle, everything, or almost everything that exists has actuality and potentiality in it. So, it is actually a certain way, and it has the potentiality to be other ways. Um, most things have the potentiality to become other than they are. Like I could stand up, right? So that's a potentiality that I have to become other than I am. And also a potentiality to change in a much more radical way by passing out of existence. This is maybe not what we're looking forward to, but like it is something that can happen. Okay. And likewise, things come into existence. All right. Now, some things in Aristotle's system, like the planets, they can change, but they only change place. It turns out he was wrong about this, but this was the idea. So that they're like these eternal things and they go around and around. They change in their location, but in every other way, they stay the same. But God is like fully actual all the time. Okay. So Aquinas, oh, wait, one more thing. For Aristotle, actuality is always prior to potentiality. So whenever you have a potentiality, it's because there was already some actuality. So Aquinas likes all this stuff. But he radicalizes it because he thinks that, well, let me see. So first of all, he thinks that potentiality in a sense goes deeper. Remember that for Aristotle, the world exists necessarily. It can't not exist. But for Aquinas, it could have happened that there just wasn't any world ever, and the world doesn't go back infinitely far in time. So there was a much deeper kind of potentiality, you might say, for there to be a world at all. But then it would be very important for Aquinas to make sure that we understand this correctly. It's not like out there, over and against God, there was this potentiality which God could then exploit. So Aquinas puts a lot of emphasis on the idea that God creates things from nothing, creation ex nihilo. So he does, and he actually goes through the exercise of saying, and I don't mean here that nothing is a special kind of thing that God can work on. No, he starts with nothing, and only God can do that. So there are kinds of possibilities or potentialities that can be actualized only by divine power. And so there's a sense in which, although everything, in the created world that we see is actual, nonetheless, it's an actuality that came ultimately from nothing, by virtue of God's infinite power. So, I mean, the actuality that remember, actuality is prior to potentiality, right? So the actuality that underwrites everything, for Aquinas, is God himself.
And that's really helpful. And I know this can be, as people are thinking through this, if they're new to it can feel very theoretical. But as we're talking about like actuality and potentiality, what Aquinas is doing here and kind of breaking with Aristotle is, like you said, radicalizing it in a way.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
idea of being able to create from nothing, because if actuality is prior to potentiality, then how are we getting this world from no actuality
yeah,
besides God, right? Like
yeah,
we're
yeah.
not just moving, we're not turning the tree into a desk now
That's right.
because
That's
there's
right.
no tree.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's good.
Eh,
And I should add, sorry, just that even whenever we try to talk about God, we're in extra high danger of making mistakes because God is so very different. But when you talk about God being actual, it can sound like he has managed to actualize all of his potentialities. But that's actually wrong. He doesn't have potentialities that miraculously he has actualized. He just is always automatically fully actual all the time. So it sounds kind of weird because we like to compliment by people by saying they have a lot of potential. But God is so great that he doesn't have any potential at all. He's
this is
all the way there and he can't be otherwise.
right. And this is where we get into the idea of God being like pure act,
That's right.
right? And I think that's a hard thing for people to wrap their mind around. But to just kind
Yes.
of press into it for a second there,
Yeah.
could we illustrate like if God wasn't pure act, like what would
Yes.
that mean? Because the first time that people hear this, I think they can be
Yeah.
like, wait, that sounds kind of strange. I don't know.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
getting a little theoretical, but maybe
Yeah.
by illustrating the alternative, we can see,
Yeah.
oh, okay, that this
Well,
makes sense.
if he wasn't pure act, then he would have to get actualized by something else. And then at that point, he's not God.
Right.
And he wouldn't be the ultimate basis of everything. So is this very easy to fall into Aristotle's way of thinking? It's probably the natural way of human thinking, to think that the real setting for everything is like the universe, and then God is like up here in the corner. He's the best part of the universe. So here I'm sort of riffing to some extent, drawing on some ideas of my colleague Robert Sokolowski. He has a short book called The God of Faith and Reason. And he makes a big deal out of this point that I'm making now, that in paganism, the final setting is the world and God is part of that. Where for Christianity, God just is on his own and he doesn't have a setting. Like there's no context that you fit God into. God is just God. But as soon as but if you lose sight of that, and it's very hard to keep sight of it. But if you lose sight of it, then all of a sudden God starts to become just another character in the world. And then you're not really talking, it's not Christianity anymore. It's paganism. It's not stupid, but I mean, it's not Christianity. So.
Yeah. And on that point, I think I'm not very involved in the apologetics world, but whenever I kind of dip my toes into the ongoing
Yeah.
conversations there, it does seem that very often what's argued against in Christianity is this God who's a discrete character in a
Yes.
creation, right? Like it's this kind of really leveled up character, but
Right.
just like the most leveled up character rather than something that's
Yeah.
qualitatively different
That's
here.
hilarious. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, to continue with the analogy a little bit, um, God is not a character in the game,
right.
right? Because he made the game. I don't know. Maybe you've taken the analogy too far, but
No, well, I think it's helpful. And I think this idea of made and creating ex nihilo does bring us to another very important kind of metaphysical idea here. And it just so happened that I had your book on top of David Hume. So this is going to tie in nicely here on my desk. But the idea of cause, right? So
yes.
this is going to be important for Aquinas, as it was for Aristotle, and anyone dealing with metaphysics, right? You have
Yeah.
to kind of talk about cause. So Aquinas has different senses of this. When we talk about cause for Aquinas, what does it mean to cause something?
Oh, well, Aquinas, it turns out, uses the word cause in a number of ways. This is one of the ideas that he draws on Aristotle for. So a cause is like an explanatory factor, and there are different kinds of causes. Aquinas' terminology here is a lot more flexible than ours is. So it takes a little bit of translating back and forth. But there's the ordinary kind of cause where you just make something happen, which in the tradition is often called an efficient cause. I don't know. I mean, I do know why. It comes from a Latin word, but like it's a terrible translation because it doesn't mean a cause that gets things done with a minimum of resources. It doesn't mean efficient. It's like an effective cause. It's a cause that makes it happen. But Aquinas will talk about what something is made out of as being a kind of cause, and he'll talk about the structure of something as being a kind of cause, and he'll talk about the goal or orientation of something as being a kind of cause. And we can see little bits of this even in our language, even if we don't often call these things causes. So if there's like some political or social goal that you're trying to bring about, we'll call it a good cause, right? So there the word cause crept in, right? And I might say, like, why does your, you know, baseball glove smell like this? And you might say, well, because it's made of leather. Now, you wouldn't necessarily have called the leather a cause of the baseball, but you said because, right? Because. So these, anything that's an explanatory factor, um, in some sort of positive way like this, is Aquinas will call that a cause.
That's helpful. And going back to, you talked about how there's kind of two senses of, we could talk about the cup or the cat existing in this kind of enclosed world
Yep.
of, its substance, whatnot. But then there's also the sense in which God is at work in all of this kind of
Yes.
sustaining.
Yep.
So could we also kind of bring cause in there of, we could look at causes of like,
Yep.
me lifting this book,
Right.
but there's going to be a cause kind of, I don't know if I want to say behind or what kind of spatial
Well,
analogy I want to use there, but
it's hard.
uh, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's right. Part of the secret is and Aquinas likes to talk about this sort of thing, to see that you can have causes that are caused causes. So we can be causes, and yet God is acting on us. So we are caused causes. We cause other things, but we are caused, where God is an uncaused cause. But it's difficult because, and this is something that comes up again and again, and that Aquinas is actually quite sensitive to, although you sometimes have to read carefully to stay aware of this. The sense whenever we talk about anything, in this case causation, what it means when we apply it in the created world, like about cats or whatever, is similar to, but also different from, what it means when we talk about God. So the sense in which you or I can be a cause is different from the sense in which God can be a cause. It's not utterly different, because if it were utterly different, really utterly different, then our words about God wouldn't mean anything. We'd just be going blah, 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 and we wouldn't know what we would say. It would sound mystical, but like it would mean nothing. And then if it was exactly the same, then that would mean that God was um, just another creature, just a leveled up character. Um, so it has to be different, and actually quite different. Now, what I mean by saying, like, sometimes Aquinas tells you this really explicitly, and so like there it is, you can't miss it. But then he doesn't always say this very explicitly, but it sneaks in a lot. So if you just read carefully, he'll say like, he'll say something about God, and he'll just add in these little phrases like "in a way," "in a sense," and he does that a lot, and I think that's what's going on here. So he has those little qualifying and weakening and hand waving phrases. He uses them a lot, actually.
Yeah, this is where we get to the idea of analogy, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, where when we're talking about God, we're saying that God is like this, or
Yeah,
we're not able to kind of fully kind of give a uh, complete description
yeah,
of how God is precisely. That's helpful. And I think that's a good segue into these areas of metaphysics outside of normal operating conditions. And I mentioned early on that we would get to
yes,
transubstantiation because if people know of Aquinas and they know he has something to do with metaphysics or he
yeah,
has, in theology, they might think, oh, yes, transubstantiation,
right,
that's all Aristotle, right? So it goes. And I'll say just one of the things that actually made me want to do an interview on this was I just put out a post of when I was studying Aristotle's metaphysics.
yeah,
I remember reading through his description of substance, accidents, change, these things, and thinking, I've always been told that transubstantiation was a thoroughly Aristotelian idea, and it really doesn't make sense
no,
if you're trying to read it from the pages of
no,
Aristotle. And so
yeah,
I think on the one hand, it was a really nice way of saying, oh, okay,
yeah,
Aquinas is doing something different. But let's talk about transubstantiation using the categories we've had so far. In what ways does it build on these, and in what ways does it maybe kind of break some of them?
yeah. Good, good. So, a lot of the words that show up in Aristotelian theories about substances and their features appear in um, appear when people talk about transubstantiation, but Aquinas um, modifies how they work in a super important way. So, so you start with the theological doctrine in question. Of course, it's a disputed one among Christians, but the claim is that um, at the celebration of the Lord's Supper, the bread ceases to be and is replaced by Christ's body. I'm skipping some steps here, but this is the basic idea. Of course, it doesn't look like that, right? The white color is still there, the shape, the round shape, the size, whatever. Those remain there. Okay. So those, the color, the shape, the way it appears to us, The appearances, in Latin, species, the species, the appearances, those were qualities of the bread, and they stick around. They keep existing. And so the bread isn't there anymore, but the qualities of the bread are still there. Now, for Aristotle, I think this just is not something that can happen, because the accidents, the whole point of being an accident is that you're in a substance. Okay. Now, Aquinas says a few things here. So, first of all, he says that this is a nice principle that he says that whatever God can do by intermediaries, he can do directly if he wants to. So, normally you send somebody a message by a messenger, you could always go and just give them the message yourself. Okay. So normally the way God causes accidents to be, like color and shape, is by causing the substances. And it's in causing, the white piece of bread that God causes the whiteness. But if God wants to, he can act independently of the created substance and just hold the accident in being all on its own. Now, before we mentioned that any kind of reality, I mean, we were talking about substances, but it applies to other realities too, like accidents, colors, and stuff. They involve powers to act and to be acted on. For Aquinas, there's a class of powers, a class of potentialities. That's what I want to say. A class of potentialities that only God can actualize. So only God could make the accidents of the bread exist apart from the bread. Now, so this is something that Aristotle would never say. It's somewhat unclear to me. I've actually been thinking about this over the past few years, where Aquinas gets this idea from. So here's what I mean. I think it's in the most obvious sense, he just gets it from his understanding of the Christian doctrine of the Eucharist, right? He just thinks this is the teaching, and so how can I make sense out of it? The appearances are still there, but the bread is no longer here. So I'm going to say that the bread has been changed into Christ's body, but the accidents of the bread keep on going. It must be that God sustains them. Then he tries to work through. He says, does Christ's body become white and round? No, actually, these accidents are not inhering in Christ's body. They're just kind of floating there. Okay. Now, weirdly though, and I hadn't noticed this until recently by reading something by some friends and colleagues, in fact, Aquinas seems to think that you can derive the possibility, just the possibility, the bare possibility, of accidents existing in this way from some doctrines of the Muslim philosopher Avicenna, which is very strange. Now, of course, Avicenna, he just sort of redefines accident and substance. So instead of saying that an accident is something that does inhere, did I say it right? An accident. Instead of saying an accident is something that does inhere in a substance, he says something that's apt to inhere, or it's sort of like the kind of thing that normally would, or something. Now he has special hyper technical reasons for doing that. But Aquinas goes, hey, wait, look at that thing. I can use that in my account of the Eucharist. And this brings out a way in which Christian revelation can be of influence on philosophy, even if in some sense a certain bare possibility could in theory be noticed by philosophy. It probably won't be. But if it's in Revelation, then you know it's happened. So if it's actual, then it must be possible. And you're like, hey, wait a minute. And now you've noticed something. I don't know if this is addressing
No, I think it
the
is.
aspect that you wanted to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it was that precise idea, which of course Aquinas addresses, right?
Yeah.
When you're reading Aristotle and you hear him talking about the way substances and accidents work together, it's like, wait, but what are we doing with the accidents of bread still being here if bread's not here?
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
what we get from Aristotle
No,
there,
so
or
this
from Aquinas is
this is
something.
one example of where Aquinas is taking something essentially that comes from Aristotle and then transforming it and using it in a way that goes beyond anything Aristotle would ever say in order to accommodate the requirements of Christian theology.
Right, precisely. And it's not because Aquinas has failed to understand Aristotle here. It's because
Oh no,
he's self-consciously doing something
he
different.
totally knows what he's doing. I mean, he has a funny he loves Aristotle. Okay, he's a big fan of Aristotle. He disagrees with him when he has to, but he's not like a scrupulous historical scholar. So sometimes he'll say, "Well, Aristotle says this," and like nowadays everybody's like, "Aristotle doesn't say that, Thomas." Like, come on, man. So he might say, well, this is implicit in the philosopher's writings or whatever. But yeah, he certainly knows sometimes you just have to disagree with Aristotle. And when you got to do it, you got to do it. He just does it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dr. Gorman, this has been an absolute pleasure. We have covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate the time you've shared and the excitement that you've brought to this subject. I'll tell people, most of the people who watch videos like mine will be excited about the idea of a book on Thomistic metaphysics. But for anyone that's maybe a bit more worried about jumping into something like that, you write with the same joy that you have in this conversation here. And it's just a fantastic introduction. So I can't recommend it enough, and links will be in the description below. But I wanted to just kind of close with, if you have any advice to someone who's maybe they watch this video, say, this is really exciting, I'm going to pick this up, I'm going to pick up your book, and I want to try to get to know Aquinas. Just what advice do you have for them along the way? You mentioned earlier kind of being in community with others.
Yeah.
But yeah, what kind of encouragement would you have for someone who's already clicked on the link, they're buying the book now?
Yeah. It's hard. Don't feel like, I mean, don't feel like, oh gosh, I read a couple chapters of this introductory book, and then I went and I tried to read some Aquinas, and it totally defeated me. Like, sure, it defeated you. That's fine. Don't feel, it's not that you're stupid. It's that the book is just incredible. Aquinas, he's just very, very hard to understand. So keep at it. Try again. Read other things. Just be patient with yourself, and you'll maybe on the third go round, you'll go like, oh, that's what's going on here. And you'll notice it. And it's not just you, right? Like, I've been doing this for a really long time. And it's still the case that when I read things that I've read many times, I will notice stuff that I hadn't noticed before. So just be patient, be determined, and yeah, just keep at it. It's okay.
I love that. That's wonderful advice. And I think the payoff is well worth it, especially with someone like Aquinas. For every little step you make, you're getting to enter into this wonderful conversation that's been going on for 800 years or so now. And it's just truly a delight to, I think, get to participate and sit at the table of those ongoing conversations. So, Dr. Gorman, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, this was my pleasure.
Okay.